Hezbollah at the kibbutz. With dedicated to the memory of Mayor Moyle, where are we at in Shoftim with Yiftach? We're in a period of disarray and infighting within the Israelite tribes themselves. What it means to be an Am, what it means to be a nation, seems more connected with peoplehood and kinship systems than with borders and territory. At this point, for 18 years, Shoftim recounts all the Israelites beyond the Jordan in the land of the Amorites and Gilead were battered and shattered in verse 8 of chapter 20. Frustrated by their infidelity to the law, God declares in verse 13, I will not deliver you anymore. But as the Ammonites gathered for a final assault on the Gileadites, determined to take back the land that the Israelites had conquered, and as the Israelites recommitted themselves to serve Adonai, God's will weakens, foreshadowing the deliverance of the Israelites once again. Meanwhile, the Gileadite leadership realized there is no leadership with the willingness or skills to counter the Ammonite assault that is upcoming. And they decide to offer the leadership to Yiftach, the son of a prostitute who, and this echoes the preceding narrative of Avimelech and the Shechemites, he has been thrown out of the tribe by his siblings and has become a warrior leader of a gang living in the hills. Yiftach accepts the leadership under a very formal agreement based on his leading victoriously an assault on the Ammonites. And this is likely, in my opinion, the inspiration for many a Western movie. The disinterested outlaws outside of the town are hired to lead the town under the condition that they defeat the enemy threat to the town. Yiftach is victorious, but what is probably best remembered about the story is that at a crucial point in the action, Yiftach makes a conditional vow to God. Should God make him victorious in battle, he in turn will sacrifice whatever comes out of his house to greet him upon his return. This turns out, of course, to be his daughter. For the rabbis, the story becomes a cautionary tale about making vows to God. For folklorists, the story seems to be a made-up origin story to explain a particular custom and ritual of Jewish female celibacy. Since Yiftach's daughter asks for a reprieve of several months during which she will remain celibate before her death, and her death is not recorded in scripture. Some of the rabbinic commentators argue that she never actually is killed, since her setting herself apart, which is what Kiddushin means, which is what sanctifying something to God means, in this way satisfies the conditions of the vow. By remaining celibate, she is set aside for God and is thus dedicated to God, so her dedication to God is complete without actual human sacrifice. This is just what some of the commentators say. In some ways, as with the story of Deborah, also from Shoftim, the narrative ending, while fascinating in itself, distracts from the actual content of the Haftarah. In Yiftach's case, what is remarkable is that for a mercenary leader of men of ill repute of a gang, Yiftach is much less a fighter than he is a master diplomat. In fully 16 verses of the Haftarah, he does not fight, but makes diplomatic arguments, asking the king of the Ammonites to state a proper claim to the land. Says, what have you against me that you have come to make war on my country? In verse 12 of the Haftarah. The answer is an allegation of unjust conquest. When Israel came from Egypt, the Ammonite ruler explained, they seized the land which is mine, so now restore it peaceably. Verse 13. Yiftach rejects the Ammonites' charge with a series of interrelated arguments. The land in question, he writes, or he argues, originally belonged to the Amorites, and so Yiftach argues the Ammonites as a third party to the conflict had no stake in it, because we're talking about the Ammonites, not the Amorites. Even if they had a right to aid another nation in redressing a claim of justice, no injustice had been done. The land came into the possession of Israel only after the king of the Amorites had denied Israel the right to pass through and then proactively attacked the Israelites when they camped outside the land. In other words, the Amorites conquered the land from the Ammonites, and then the Amorites attacked the Israelites who were trying to settle other lands, and then were defeated. In this sense, the Ammonites should take up their claim with the Amorites, the people who conquered them in the past, if they wish, but history has moved on through the Amorites' defeat. Finally, Yiftach wondered why the Ammonites waited 300 years to press their claims on behalf of the Amorites, if there were any valid claims to begin with. The resonances for today are plain to see. If the Bible is clear about anything, it seems to be clear about the fact that the biblical territories were not nation states with clear territories, but rather peoples with movable borders and areas in which they dwelled. Midianites from what we might call Arabia today, or Saudi Arabia, or Yemen, could at one point have solid possessions in the land of Israel. Moabites from what we might call Jordan today, or perhaps the countries around it. Hittites are there from what we call Syria. They can have possessions in the land, territories. Interestingly, number states that the area between the rivers Arnon and Jabbok from the Torah portion was originally Moabite territory and was subsequently conquered by Sihon, who in turn lost the land to the Israelites. However, when the book of Judges recounts this incident in a dialogue between Yiftach and the king of Abnon, it seems that the territory had originally belonged to the Ammonites, not the Moabites. So we have different peoples in different places in the land, conquering each other and finding ways to live around each other. Fundamental assumptions here may feel commonsensical to many of us. For example, it might seem to be common sense that the modern institution of the nation state, with self-conscious national identity and particular borders, is anachronistically applied to the conditions of the land of Israel prior to the 20th century. With land going back and forth, with multiple people shifting territories within the land itself, often in close proximity, with their ethnic and quasi-national identities rooted not in these territories, but often in historical and kinship ties to lands far outside these territories, areas like Transjordan, areas that go up into what was the Ottoman Empire. It seems absurd to be presented with the logic that the Israelites today are an invading force upon a long-standing nation in the land. It seems unreal that Yiftach's arguments almost 3,000 years ago are more logical than ones that are passed on uncritically today. Not that the Torah is devoid of misleading perspectives. It includes statements that all of the land belongs to the Israelites through divine promise, and the mischief this can do in the real world is absolutely terrifying. But divine promise is not political theory, and it is not diplomatic argument. It remains categorically theoretical, as it should, and as it should remain. The writer Alex Stein wrote this week, separate from the Torah portion and the Haftarah, that today both Palestinians and Jews argue that they are indigenous to the land. The Palestinians increasingly claim that they are descendants of the ancient Canaanites who have remained on the land ever since, changing their identity only due to foreign conquest. Jews, meanwhile, often draw a direct line between the ancient Jewish inhabitants of the land and the Israeli Jews of today. And in Alex Stein's opinion, both are wrong. How did they view one another more than a century ago before the conflict developed in full force? The historian Jonathan Mark Gribetz attempts to answer this question in his fascinating book, Defining Neighbors, Religion, Race, and the Early Zionist-Arab Encounter. He argues that the two groups viewed one another in terms of two main categories prior to 1948, religion and race. As he puts it, these communities understood one another not as complete strangers, engaging with each other for the first time in a modern nationalist struggle over a contested piece of land, but rather as peoples encountering a deeply familiar, if at times mythologized or distorted, others. The Palestinians did not think they were descended from the Canaanites, nor did they deny the Jewish connection to the land. As the writer and politician Muhammad Ruhi al-Khalidi wrote to Eliezer ben Yehuda, "We conquered this land not from you Jews. We conquered it from the Byzantines who ruled it at the time. We owe nothing to the Jews who were not here when we conquered the land from them." In some ways, this is Yiftach's argument, right? Which is, we're not dealing with ancient claims to the land. We're just dealing with the fact that we beat the Byzantines. And so if you have a problem, go talk to the Byzantines. It's amazing how the arguments align with the diplomatic arguments of Scripture. As Gribetz notes, this phrasing implicitly acknowledges that the Jews had been in the land before. Moreover, for Al-Khalidi, history, even that of remote time, was of real importance in the modern period. The Arab conquest of Palestine occurred over 1,000 years earlier, and yet Al-Khalidi does not discount the contemporary relevance of the details of the historic conquest. His uncle Yusuf Daya Al-Khalidi even famously said, "The Zionist idea in itself is only natural, beautiful, and just. Who can contest the rights of the Jews in Palestine? My God, historically, it is your country." Al-Khalidi wrote an unpublished book, Zionism or the Zionist Question, Zionfrage, which described the history of the Israelites from the Bible to the present, and in it he accepted the link between the Israelites and contemporary Jews. He wrote, "The captives in Babylonia demonstrated their abundant yearning for Zion and Jerusalem. No nation among the nations reached their height of grieving over their homelands and the degree of their longing for it. They wandered along the banks of the Euphrates, crying over Jerusalem and bewailing her in poems and psalms." The ways in which Jews and Arabs saw each other was not indigenous and colonialist, but was in religious terms and in quasi-historical terms, political, diplomatic terms. Racially, Arab writers at the time saw the Yeshuvniks not so much as European, but in many ways as other Semites, as Jews, but not as European colonialists. And Gribetz writes, historically, importantly, the early Zionists didn't see the Arabs in Palestine as some generic, nondescript, indigenous population wrongfully living in the Jews' rightful homeland. Rather, these populations were communities with which Jews had long and complex histories as members of interconnected religious civilizations or as members of the same race. And that's how he concludes his work. The layer that we've been laid on top of the conflict happening before us as an example of post-colonialist theory and European conquest, where I this week had to fill out an application for a Jewish camp, and the only option for me for race was European white. These overlays are not appropriate. They weren't appropriate 100 years ago, and they were not the arguments that were made. May we return to a proper diplomatic and not violent arguments that are not based on theocracy, or if they are, may they be transparently so. And otherwise, legitimate arguments about our conflict is not with you. You got to talk to the people before that. That's the place to start a conversation with the biblical logic that is both commonsensical to us and to the Tanakh. Shabbat Shalom. Musaf begins on page 148.